Well, hello everyone. How are you doing? I did take a week off, but we are back to where we left off in this very extended discussion about the Reason Magazine /debate / discussion about the national divorce. But if you remember, I had said I had wanted to bring up to discuss, because this was part of the very minor disagreement I had with Dave Smith on this and my particular view of no particular orderism. And I brought up that a friend of mine had written an article called Against Stockholm Libertarianism that I wanted to bring up. Now, you might not find this article persuasive, but I'll tell you that this article changed my mind, or at least got me on the path to changing my mind on what exactly hardcore, consistent libertarianism was. Now, I'm not going to be so arrogant to say that anyone who disagrees with me on this isn't consistent or isn't hardcore. I'm just telling you my perspective and the way I saw it, that this revolutionized my outlook. And again, it's a very simple article, and you know how some things touch one person and might not touch another. I remind you that you can always get in touch with me at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com. Now let's get into this article. Again, it's called Against Stockholm Libertarianism, and it's by Tom Knapp, K-N-A-P-P, and his website is called Napster. And he says, and again, I think this article's from 2008, so it's going to be a bit dated in some parts, but you'll get the point. We should repeal all of America's 20,000 odd gun control laws. But of course, we can't do that until we've eliminated homicide. We should close down the war on drugs. But of course, we can't do that until we've scourged away every last vestige of the human desire for intoxication. We should eliminate Social Security. But of course, we can't do that until all of its current and future payees lie a moldering in the grave, having never missed a monthly check. If I put any of these propositions up for debate, my fellow libertarians would make short work of me. They'd have my head on a platter. It would be easy, because all three of these propositions are ridiculous on their faces. Funny, a lot of people probably wouldn't think the Social Security one was, though, particularly so-called conservatives. And then he gives a quote. And this isn't his quote, he's quoting somebody else. Under the present welfare system, a vote for open borders is a vote for higher taxes for all. Someday, the libertarian message of peace, liberty, and prosperity will reach the entire world. All people will then enjoy the freedom and high standard of living we take for granted. And that day, immigration and open borders will be non-issues. And he goes, sound familiar? That's George Phillies, candidate for the Libertarian Party's 2008 presidential nomination. And then he quotes someone else. We must secure our borders before we can deal with the issue of how to deal with illegal immigrants already in our country. And he says, heard something like that somewhere before? That's Wayne Allen Root, candidate for the Libertarian Party's 2008 presidential nomination. He continues. Physically secure our borders and coastlines. We must do whatever it takes to control entry into our country before we undertake complicated immigration reform proposals. Taxpayers should not pay for illegal immigrants who use hospitals, clinics, schools, roads, and social services. Ring a bell? Hey, it's Ron Paul, Republican presidential nomination candidate. I'm including him because despite his recent born-again hard claims to represent conservatism, I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm just taking this as for granted, these claims. I've never heard him say that. Most libertarians regard him as one of our own. I certainly regard him as one of our own. I've got my Ron Paul candle over there. Thank you very much. It's not just presidential candidates, of course. And then he quotes again. The problem with so many libertarian formulations is that they do not respect reality. Rather, they hold up the libertarian ideal, lament its unattainability. I never lament its unattainability. I think the libertarian ideal is extraordinarily attainable. If we just agree not to coerce each other, what a concept. And refuse to debate the issue until the ideal is achieved. That's intellectual lazy. It's also an affront to reality, the rational man's anchor. And the reality is that the American welfare state is accreting, not shrinking. The reality is that the more libertarians support the importation of impoverished minorities with a tradition of aggressively manipulating the political apparatus to obtain property not theirs, God, that is... I don't know how anyone could say something like that and not hear the way they sound. The more intractable the welfare state will become. And that's Ilana Mercer, the work open borders libertarians won't do at Free Market News Network. And then another quote, "This is what's evident in the current debate about illegal immigration. The welfare state is the underlying fundamental problem. Until that system is abolished, until a revolutionary change occurs, and no Peter is looted for the sake of any Paul, whether poor, rich, illegal, or illegal, there will be no solution to the illegal immigration problem." And he says that's Tibor, our Machen welfare state and illegal immigration in the Orange County Register. He continues. In a world with radically different levels of economic freedom, and thus of economic prosperity, relatively free and prosperous nations cannot allow completely unrestricted immigration without risking serious socio-economic disruption. And that is Brian Holtz, Iraq Exit, Social Security and Immigration in Knowing Humans. And then here's where he drives it home. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a hostage situation. It's a neat scam, this holding of one positive reform hostage, while around the corner, your political enemies hold its counterpart hostage as well. You won't let your hostage go until they let their hostage go, and they won't let their hostage go until you let yours go, and they'd really rather you didn't. No muss, no fuss. You've both successfully avoided responsibility. They've avoided doing something they don't want to do anyway, and you've avoided doing something you claim you want to do but are looking for an excuse not to advocate. It's the pleading prayer of St. Augustine, and I'll never pronounce this. It's Latin, I think. Da mihi castitatem et continuationem sed noli modo, whatever. Cleverly disguised as a practical political necessity. There are probably as many extant definitions of libertarianism as there are libertarians. Even zero aggression principle libertarians often disagree on what course that principle dictates in various circumstances. Among the strangest of these definitions is this: I stand for freedom just as soon as those other guys do and not a moment before. Nonsense. As popular as know-nothing bull crap, festooned with, I'd love to advocate immigration freedom, but first you have to convince that guy over there to give up his food stamps, hostage-taking camouflage seems to have become in what passes for a libertarian movement these days. I'm not surprised we're not all running into each other at Stockholm Syndrome survivor conventions. Now, again, that may not have convinced you, but it certainly did me. Because what it is, at its core, is central planning. We think we can centrally plan liberty. Of all people, libertarians should know better. We know in nearly everything else that central planning doesn't work. Yet we think, well, we can't have this freedom till we have that freedom. If one is really necessary before the other can happen, reality will make sure that happens. You don't need to plan it. If you have to plan it, it's unnatural, and you're forcing it, and it'll probably never happen. Did you not learn the lesson of iPencil? Spontaneous order works in all systems, not just economics. It will work in the arranging of how the progress of liberty will end up happening in our lives or in the lives of our children. So at least hope that you will give that a thought. Okay, we will continue with the debate clips that I've done in the past after this break. But remember, before we go to break, approval voting moves us beyond two-party thinking. It will lead to fewer spoilers, as voters can vote for both a candidate that they really like, who has no chance of winning, and also a more popular candidate who does have a chance of winning. Approval voting moves us beyond two-party thinking. If you're interested in hearing more, contact Colorado's approval voting effort by phone or text at 720-439-6000 or search for the Approval Voting Party. All right, see you on the other side of the break. All right, we are back, and now let us continue where we had left off on a prior show.
Like, he was like, this is what we're really against, and what we really care about is not being completely pure on driver's licenses, but we care about being completely pure on the wars and the Federal Reserve and the war on drugs and the police state and like these things that really matter.
Well, I'm going to stop here because, again, I said this last time. I do disagree with him there. I think, I'm going to quote a little scripture here. He who is faithful in the small things will also be faithful in the large things. That's a paraphrase, I know. But I think the paraphrase is faithful to the intent. And once again, I don't presume to tell people what should be important to them. And I don't think there's any libertarian who doesn't care about the large things. But to say you don't care about the small things too, no, I just fundamentally disagree there. And I actually think driver's licenses are a somewhat big thing. But let's continue.
And then trying to coalition with everybody, whether it's Dennis Kucinich or Bernie Sanders or whoever, on any one issue that might be really important.
Well, I absolutely agree on the coalition building. And I would say on any issue. Because anytime freedom is being impinged, it's important.
Dave and I agree on the importance of single-issue coalitions, a strategy that's been remarkably successful at, for example, advancing school choice in both deep blue cities and red states. We also agree that the protection of individual rights is fundamental to a peaceful and prosperous society, perhaps just not on how best to achieve it. Is rooting for the breakup of the USA at this moment in time really all?
Oh, that at this moment in time really gets me. Listen, I can respect if he thinks the idea is just not a libertarian one or not one that will produce good results, or he just disagrees. But at this moment in time, the reason that gets me is I just hear shades of, it's great to vote for a third-party candidate, but not this election. This is not this moment in time. This is the most important election ever. Well, with this idea, we can't be coercing people to be in a country that we're just not all getting along in, and some people would be, that their freedom, they believe that their freedom will be best served by being in a smaller, more locally controlled community, but it just isn't the right time. Your liberty's gonna have to wait.
Libertarian? This question reminds me of the litmus test posited by the anarcho-capitalist economist Murray Rothbard, whose work has had a major influence on Dave Smith and the current Libertarian Party leadership.
Okay, it's had... Here's something funny. He makes it... A lot of times these folks from Reason do this, and I don't know why, because I do think they know better. While it is true that Murray Rothbard has had a big influence on current Libertarian Party leadership, the way he says that, he makes it sound like it's something novel. No, the aberration is for Rothbard not to be a big influence. People forget that Rothbard was on the Libertarian National Committee in the 1970s. People forget that no particular orderism was an actual resolution of the Libertarian National Committee, that he's been on the platform committee. I would say for more periods of time than not, but at least half, that this type of thinking has had a major influence, and certainly had a major influence on the early party. So he didn't come out and say it was an aberration, but I think that is somewhat of the implication. And I think you can be influenced by Rothbard without being, as I started this whole series with, a button pusher, a Rothbard's button pusher. And I gave what I believe are principled libertarian arguments not to be. But let me tell you, if it were possible, see, that's the whole thing about Rothbard's button, is he even conceded, but alas, such a button doesn't exist. And I don't find that much utility in arguing these angels dancing on a head of a pin arguments of things that will never exist, that are pure fantasy. They might be fun as a libertarian drinking game, but they are not much use for more than that.
Button existed that would immediately abolish the state, that is, all government. A radical libertarian, Rothbard writes, would blister his thumb pushing it, while so-called gradualists, including fellow anarcho-capitalist theorist David Friedman and those of us at Reason magazine, would hold back as we fretted over the unintended consequences.
My fretting is over the actual intended consequences and questioning whether they're libertarian or not. But a distinction that he failed to make there, and again, I don't think this was intentional, is there was a context to Rothbard's use of the word radical versus gradualist. He was talking about people that not necessarily people that understand that the road to liberty might take a gradual path. It's that those who insist that it must take a gradual path. And there is a difference between those two concepts.
So is that where you fall? You would be, blistering that thumb, pushing the button to blow up the state if you could?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I think another point that Rothbard made, which is it pretty clearly indicated in the title of the piece there, do you hate the state?
And I agree, that's the real question. Do you hate the state? And I think he was using the pushing the button as a stand-in for that. And that is actually the issue. Do you hate the state? And I can unequivocally say yes.
Way. I'm a fan of David Friedman. I read David Friedman's chapter in Michael Malice's Anarchist Handbook, and I loved it. It's like a brilliant piece. But with David Friedman, what you almost always get are these.
Okay, I'm going to stop here because I love the way he did that. He can disagree with David Friedman on an issue, but still love him and think he's brilliant. I disagree with Dave Smith on some issues, but I love him, and he's a fantastic spokesperson for liberty.
Very brilliant technical arguments about the inefficiency of governments. And I don't think Murray Rothbard would disagree with 99% of his literature. But the point Rothbard's making is that on a human level, when you look at this institution, you should be filled with rage and passion. In the same way that the example that I like to use is, if you were talking about slavery, and your comment on slavery was, well, I think that overall this is an inefficient way to pick cotton, and that a voluntary system of cooperation would produce more cotton at a lower price.
And I absolutely agree. And I think the point that he's making there is that you always have to end up going to the principled argument. You can make, and you should make, Also, in the same breath, or, in the same argument, the consequentialist or utilitarian argument, but that can't be your only. You have to rely on principle, because someone could out-argue the utility. If slaves were the most efficient way to pick cotton, it would still be wrong. And that's the point we need to be sure we are making.
Mm-hmm. There's just something kind of weird about that being your feeling. You know what I mean? Like, agreed, that is all true, but you should hate the institution of slavery with a passion, because these are real human beings who are being destroyed and having their existence robbed from them. So that's, to me, kind of like the split. When I look at the federal government, I don't think to myself like, oh, as many libertarians do, they'll kind of have this thing where it's like, what a bunch of jokers with all of their unintended consequences and these do-gooder programs that really end up backfiring. And I'm like, I don't think they backfire. They enrich all the people who they're trying to enrich.
And I think there's a point there that gets lost on a lot of us. Some of us can be quite Pollyanna and want to think everyone has the best of intentions, and think that all the bad things that end up from government, or not all of them, or the vast majority of them, oh, that's just unintended. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't know. A lot of what the state does, I think, does exactly what it's intended to do. And that we need to stop presuming good intentions, because things have turned out so badly that it's a very warped universe when these pure and just beautiful intentions turn out so hideously. But speaking of someone who understands this, what do you think of that segue? Costs are going up, government spending is going up, and freedom and opportunities seem to be stagnating. Time and again, our governments at every level have had to learn the lesson everyday Americans know all too well. The bill comes due, the chickens come home to roost. The more out of control government spending gets, the harder it becomes to rein it in. Send Daniel Lutz to Denver, and he will work to bring our spending under control. He knows that's your money and not the government's, and he will treat it that way. This was paid for by the committee to elect Daniel Lutz to House District 49. Thank you for giving Daniel, who's a friend of mine and a wonderful sponsor of this show, your consideration. Okay, welcome back, and let's just continue.
I look at the federal government of the United States of America as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, that is responsible for, just in the last 20 years, the deaths of millions of Muslim people in third world countries, which, by the way, has also made quite a few people very rich. So to me, that's really the fundamental split. It's like, how evil do you think this organization is?
And again, I would agree. We need to stop assuming good intentions. There isn't. You don't engage in the wholesale killing of people the way our government has in these unjustified, undeclared wars innocently. It's not an oopsie.
See, what I view as a fundamental split is the method to getting to a smaller state, maybe even no state. Let's say Rothbard's thought.
Again, central planning. You can't centrally plan liberty. This is so frustrating to me. Why don't we just try every way we can? Now, of course, I could hear him do a pushback. Yeah, but there's no going back from what you want to try. But there's also not knowing what we don't try. And where is the principle? Is it okay to force a government on people who don't want it? Is consent of the governed still a thing?
Experiment had some plausibility to it, and you could eliminate the state. The question just immediately rises, what comes in its wake?
You can't always know that. Are you saying that we have to know every... You know, people could have said this at the time of the Revolutionary War without a king. What's gonna come next? Again, these are all just utilitarian arguments. Where's the principled argument from him? That's what I want to hear.
So, how do you feel about the idea that we've never seen in modern history a functioning anarchic society, so we need to kind of proceed with caution?
And for thousands and thousands of years, we hadn't seen societies or a world where, in general, though I know it hasn't been completely eliminated and probably never will, where owning other people and slavery wasn't a thing.
And kind of slowly unwind to get there rather than burn it all down, let's say.
What if it's impossible to slowly unwind to get there? There are some things that we do in life that you have to have enough momentum to get past the inertia point. Haven't we had enough? The transition from monarchy to what we have now, once it started, it happened rapidly. Big changes tend to happen rapidly, particularly big evolutionary jumps. Am I doing the political version of the, you know, the mockery that used to be done back in Darwin's time, where the hopeful monster theory, which funny enough is starting to make a little bit of a resurgence in a different form, but with epigenetics. I'm getting a little bit off track, but I think political history bears it out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends exactly on what you mean by burn it all down. I mean, I'm not opposed to unwinding. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not against. I'd be very happy with.
Yeah, same here. I'd be very happy with any step towards liberty, but I don't want to artificially limit us to gradualism.
Any step that would unwind, you know, if, let's say, the national divorce, even just talking about it, like, moves the Overton window to where people are actually thinking about that, but we settle for like radical decentralization or a strong 10th Amendment, or, you know.
Amen, preach it, brother. You know, I believe I said this in an earlier show, but, you know, some principles bear repeating. I work as a paralegal, and in some of the past cases, when I used to work in Florida, I used to be involved in a lot of mediations. And let me tell you, when you go into mediation, you never say what you'll settle for. You say what you absolutely want. And then you negotiate from there. You don't negotiate from your bottom line.
Something like that, I'd be quite happy with that compromise. I'm not against moving in that direction. The question is more to me about, again, like, what exactly are we saying by burn it all down? I mean, are we talking about burning down the military-industrial complex that has, you know, like a current genocide going on in Yemen on its hands? That I'm very happy to burn down.
Okay, and now that I'm going to walk back a tiny bit, and it's not even walk back, but it's adding some nuance. I agree with him there that some of the methods, and method's not even the right word either, because violence is always off the table. Everything in this conversation is set in the context of peacefully, non-coercively. But yeah, for things that are actually like killing other people, there would be a lot more I'd be willing to tolerate for that to go away than perhaps for lesser violations of liberty. So on one hand, a violation of liberty is a violation of liberty. Again, using a Christian example, you often will hear Christians say sin is sin. But there is a but, even though I know the statement can be made, everything before the but is a lie. No, but there is a but. While sin may be sin, and while liberty violations are liberty violations, we all know there's a difference between stealing a pencil and killing somebody.
Well, I guess a concrete example would be in the case of a national divorce, a major state like Texas seceding from the Union, and then a kind of falling of the dominoes where now.
Okay, I gotta stop here. I'm sorry I'm interrupting a lot. I guess I'm not sorry, but I'm wanting to catch these points as I'm thinking of them. It's almost when people talk, and I'm not saying it's just him, but we'll go, well, if Texas leaves or if California leaves, as if we have some claim on them, as if us in some other state, we have something we can demand of them, that they have to stay. I don't know, I'm not putting my finger on it perhaps well, but it's just something about it that gives me the heaves.
How the Constitution does not really apply to the people living in the United States. So we're saying, we don't have a need for this anymore. We're just going to kind of discard the past couple hundred years.
Okay, if a state that you're not in, that you're not part of, who's this we that you're talking about? Can't people make that choice? And you're acting as if the rights don't exist independent of that. The Constitution at its best, in the places where it is great and was a huge leap forward, codifies rights we already have. We're not granted the rights because they're written down. And you're acting as if you don't have that particular writing, that you don't have the rights. And that's a non sequitur.
Of history and try something new. Is that what you have in mind when you are entertaining the idea of a national divorce?
Okay, I haven't listened to what Dave says in response here in a bit, since I got these clips. I'm wondering if he goes the same way I do. I guess we'll see here.
I'd almost have to reject the premise of the question. And the point, and I think why so many people are at the point of entertaining this idea of a national divorce, is that the Constitution has already been disregarded. And I mean, you give me an amendment to the Bill of Rights, and I'll tell you how the federal government has wildly violated it.
Yeah, true. There's nothing about, as libertarians sometimes jokingly say, the magic piece of paper that has secured our rights. And in fact, it gives you the illusion of having them. Well, you always have them. It gives you the illusion that the government is honoring them when they're not, when it's not.
Every possible way you could imagine.
He's right that words written down on an old piece of paper aren't enough to protect our rights, but they do matter. As Austrian Nobel Prize winner F.A. Hayek wrote, "The only safeguard against creeping tyranny is a clear awareness of the dangers by the public."
But that doesn't necessitate. Listen, I'm not saying this at all in this particular show to denigrate the Constitution. I'm just saying that his conclusions are not following.
Being a written constitution that venerates individual rights make them part of a political creed which the people will defend even when they do not fully understand its significance.
Wow, that almost sounded cultic, though. It's written down, therefore it's part of a public consciousness that people will defend without even understanding it. I'd rather have people understand their rights even if they're not written down. Wow, that's very culty mind-washy to me.
Defending institutions that emerged to meet precisely the challenge of safeguarding liberty, such as the courts, the media, think tanks, advocacy organizations, was a major theme in Hayek's work. What we must learn to understand is that human civilization has a life of its own, he wrote, and that we must cautiously and humbly aim at a piecemeal rather than total reform to avoid the kinds of bloody and barbaric upheaval that ideologues of the 20th century inflicted on much of the world.
All right, we are back for the final segment.
Does this cautious approach mean every government institution must be preserved? Of course not.
Straw man, I don't think anyone would get that from that. When you're talking about piecemeal, I mean, piecemeal is going a piece at a time, but it is still getting rid of pieces. I don't think anyone would understand that as anything being preserved. So when you're saying, of course not, like, if you're arguing against something that nobody really is saying, that's called a straw man, Dorothy.
I'd like to see a libertarian president immediately shut down federal agencies, end America's foreign military occupations, and for the Supreme Court to declare the modern administrative state unconstitutional.
That is pretty radical, though. So we could easily get someone in to be the foil to what you're saying and say how that would destabilize so much. Do you not care about the environment? What would come immediately after if we didn't have the EPA? The same arguments that you're using against Dave, I could use against your modest proposals, with all apologies to Jonathan Swift. All right, let's go to the next clip, shall we?
We should be engaging in political struggle and pressuring courts however they can to protect Americans' liberties against all governments, federal, state, and local. The most effective method for increasing freedom is the use of technological tools.
Okay, I mean, he's favoring decentralization here, but that's the whole argument, isn't it? Now, those tools, I would agree with him, are really powerful. But once again, God, it's the human instinct to want to centrally plan.
Allow us to bypass the state altogether and extend the scope of the Bill of Rights. Print your own guns, communicate through encrypted services, build new worlds in cyberspace, and hold and transact in Bitcoin, which the government can't censor or devalue.
And that's all great, but that has to do with the national divorce. How? That because we can do these things, we shouldn't do these things? I'm a bit flummoxed. But just not now. I'm not going to rule out voting for a third party in the future, but just not now. Let's listen to that again.
Dave Smith took the time to talk all this through. And he did convince me not to rule out future independence movements as a check against tyranny.
How is it any different?
And I appreciate that he could acknowledge the perils of talking loosely about something as consequential and potentially bloody as a national divorce.
And I want to be clear, I think this gentleman's been charming. I'm not trying to bust his hump, but I do think there was a lot of double talk going on. But let's continue.
In a reply to Murray Rothbard, David Friedman stressed the value of humility in politics, writing that my arguments and Rothbard's could be wrong. Some sort of government might be the least bad alternative among workable human institutions. Again,
that's just ipsedixit. I think humility tends to be an attractive, in most things, an attractive personal characteristic, but I don't think it's necessary. And I think some of the leaps forward we've had in just, and I'm not necessarily saying in politics, but like, let's take the innovations that Apple has made. One thing I would not say of Steve Jobs is that he was humble.
Rothbard, on the other hand, was certain he was right and viewed disagreement as war. That's why I'm not a button pusher like Rothbard or Dave Smith.
Okay, Rothbard he had a personality that was abrasive. That has nothing to do with his ideas. He tended to make enemies amongst other people in the liberty movement. And I'm not going to try to psychologize someone from the grave to say why that was. We just know that it was.
I want to know what comes after the collapse of the state.
And if you never get that answer, then here we are. This is the Stockholm libertarianism. You can have a good guess, but, you know, I always do these weird analogies, but if you remember the original Jurassic Park, when, you know, you just, freedom isn't a tame lion, you know, you don't know what's going to happen when you bring back the dinosaurs. Nature gets away from you. You can't plan this. Fly, be free. I'm sorry, I just find this extraordinarily frustrating. Okay, let's just continue. There's only a couple clips left.
And we simply cannot know. Always proceed with caution in the face of
He just said if you can't know, then you are basically saying we can't go forward because we can't know. And I want to know, but we can't know. So please stop. Make it stop.
certainty. A dramatic national divorce and the ensuing total reform that Hayek warned about could lead to a more libertarian world.
And the Revolutionary War. I mean, every argument you're making is an argument against the founding of this country. You want to know what? The English, pre-Revolutionary War time to be, there were predations of the monarchy on what was going on in England, but in general, the standard of living for an Englishman was quite high. And you had the protection of the world empire at that time. And you did not know what was coming next. You easily could have given into fear at that time. All of the arguments you're making now are arguments against the American experiment, if only you were back in the time where it was between the patriots and the loyalists.
Or it could lead to chaos and destroy the hard-won liberties that emerged from centuries of unplanned human effort. It's a gamble.
Notice the word unplanned? Unplanned? I don't think you realize you just contradicted yourself. All right, we're moving on to his final clip.
How lucky do you feel? The Constitution isn't a holy text. It's not an all-powerful shield against government.
And it's not protecting our rights now. It might be somewhat, but it's fallen far.
Tyranny. But it is, as Frederick Douglass once put it, a glorious liberty document. For libertarians, it can be a weapon, quite a powerful one, in the arsenal needed to defend our liberties and decentralize power.
And so can just arguments about our rights. And it seems that the only time in this interview, and again, I like this guy, and I'm hating to be somewhat, very, very, not somewhat, very, very critical, but why are you only making these rights-based arguments when you're bringing up the Constitution rather than basing it on the nature of being human qua human? As if these rights would not exist without the document. You keep saying that you don't think it's a magic document. You really say out of one side of your mouth, that you understand that it can be a paper tiger, but you're not given the alternative, the source from which it springs. You are venerating the result rather than the source.
Instead of tossing it aside, maybe the task is figuring out how better to wield it.
Maybe the task is figuring out how better to make sure that our actual rights are protected, rather than clinging on to a past and something which had a noble purpose and in its original intent. Again, such a leap forward, and while we're in the system we are in now, we do need to defend the fact, as it's codified. I do believe the Constitution can be a powerful, peaceful weapon in the hands of libertarians to argue for our rights, but it cannot end there, because our rights don't come from the Constitution. The Constitution comes from our rights. Carts and horses come into play here. And even, at the time I'm recording this, look at the way like the president just blithely ignored that he doesn't have the power to just declare that student loans are, up to a certain amount, are just forgiven. We are sliding back into effectively a monarchy, a cult of personality, a power trip around whoever is president. And it happened with Trump too. So I'm an equal opportunity blaster here. But each day we see further predations upon our rights. You really think our rights are being protected when we've been through the COVID regime? Do you really? The government locked us in our houses. The government told people they weren't essential. The government said you couldn't earn a living. After that, do you really think our rights are being protected and that drastic solutions might be called for?
You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business, not because they want to